Genesis 25, we're looking at the births of Jacob and Esau. Acts 17:11 reminds us to receive the word with great eagerness and examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things are so. Now let's ask God to bless our study. Blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us and commands us to immerse ourselves in the words of Torah. Sweeten the words of your Torah in our mouths. Blessed are you, Lord, giver of the Torah. Amen. In contrast to chapter 24, which is a long, complex narrative, Genesis chapter 25 is really going to be maybe more like vignettes or short stories. We just have a couple of verses on a particular topic, and then we're moving on to the next topic. So we're going to look at Abraham and Keturah, Abraham's death, the line of Ishmael, which is interesting because Ishmael is not the son of promise, and yet the divine narrator wants us to know that Ishmael was blessed as a son of Abraham. Then we'll look at Rebekah's pregnancy. So we'll get into the story of Jacob and Esau. We'll look at the birth narrative, and then we'll conclude with the famous story of Esau despising his birthright and Jacob really taking advantage of the situation to have Esau sell him his birthright. 25 verse 1. Now Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore to him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shuah. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Asherim, Letushim, and Leumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanach, Abida, and Eldaah. All of these were the sons of Keturah. The sages note that the Hebrew word for wife, which is Isha, can simply mean woman. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that Keturah was the same status of a wife as someone like Sarah. In fact, based on verse 6, where these sons actually do not receive a blessing, we can infer that Keturah was more like a concubine, perhaps similar to Hagar. So we're going to see that Isaac is the favored son. Ishmael still receives a blessing, but these other sons are just going to receive gifts and they will be sent away. Of all these names, Midian is the most prominent nation. It bordered the Negev and Sinai regions to the south of Israel. Midian is going to be a territory well known to Moses. When he spends 40 years on the backside of the desert, it will be in the region of Midian, and his father-in-law Jethro will be a priest of Midian. And so that means Moses has married into the line of Keturah. There's actually a linguistic connection between Medina in Saudi Arabia, and that's the second holiest city in Islam, and ancient Midian. It's this exact same territory in the same region. In fact, in Arabic, Yathrib, which means Jethro, is another name for Medina. And so there's all of these connections going on. Midianites will be the ones who pulled Joseph out of a pit and sell him for 20 pieces of silver, which is interesting. We'll get to that much later in Genesis. Also in that list were Sheba and Dedan, and they're associated with the Arabian Peninsula. So the author, really despite modern tensions between Arabs and Jews, the author, the narrator, is going out of his way to establish these links between Abraham and really all of the peoples of Arabia. Although it's, later the Midianites will align with the Moabites and become enemies, but at least for now, all the sons of Abraham are living in peace with each other. Now Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east. These are all the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age. An old man, satisfied with life, I love that phrase, and he was gathered to his people. So all this is to protect Isaac as the sole inheritor. The other sons of the lower status wives were given gifts and then symbolically and literally sent away. Paul's going to use this story to make a point that not every son of Abraham is entitled to inherit. So just because you can claim that you're on the team doesn't mean you're going to inherit like Isaac did. We'll look at that in conjunction with Jacob and Esau a little bit later. Again, I love the phrase satisfied with life. Lancaster writes, if man wants to live a satisfied life like Abraham, he cannot look to the things of the material world for satisfaction. Abraham died satisfied because he had caught a glimpse of the world to come and placed his hopes there. So in the immediate context, gathered to his people means, it's just an idiom for death. But we need to remember that God created us as body and spirit. And then after the fall, both became separated from God. And then at death, the spirit reunites with God, but there is still a separation of body and spirit. Things are still out of order. So while it's true the spirit is gathered back to glory, the body is gathered with Sarah in the earth and eventually his other relatives. So in other words, many scholars here will see a hint of the afterlife, although you will read in many commentaries that the ancient Israelite religions did not include an afterlife, but that just appears to be at odds with what we're seeing here. So part of us lives on after the body dies, but we're still in a deficit situation because God created us body and soul, and so we're meant to dwell together. Protestants don't put a whole lot of emphasis on the resurrection, but it is powerful and really it's absolutely necessary to restore us back to the way things were before the fall, which is the way God intended. So remember, we're designed, it's not that the body is bad and the spirit is good. God designed them both. It is our sin that makes the flesh bad. And so they're designed to be united and living in perfection with God. Then his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah. So they put aside their differences and came together to honor their father. In the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, facing Mamre. This is again in Hebron. We studied this in chapter 23. The field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. It came about that after the death of Abraham, that God blessed his son Isaac. And Isaac lived by Bir Lahai Roi, or the God of the living God who sees me. And again, that's a reference back to Hagar and chapter 16. So again, Isaac and Ishmael set aside their differences, just as Esau and Jacob eventually will when Isaac dies. So we see this theme of reconciliation. Machpelah is Hebron. The well is in the vicinity of Beersheba, and you can see they're not that far apart, although a good maybe a day's distance away. And we focus on the blessings that Isaac received, but the next section we're about to get into reminds us that God did not forget his promise to bless Ishmael as well. So let's look at Ishmael's line. Now these are the records of the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's slave woman, the narrator's reminding us of that, bore to Abraham. And these are the names of the sons of Ishmael by their names in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, Kedar, Adbel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Masa, Hadad, Tima, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their villages and their camps, 12 princes according to their tribes. So it's interesting that Isaiah prophesies that the Arab peoples belonging to Kedar and Nebaioth, the first two of Ishmael's sons, they will believe in the Jewish God and bring flocks of sheep and rams to the Jewish temple. So Isaiah 60 verse 7, all the flocks of Kedar will be gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth will serve you. They will go up on my altar with acceptance, and I will glorify my house. So I think that's fascinating because one of Paul's subtle arguments. So remember, one of the naysayers or the antagonists against Paul were saying, all these Gentiles coming to faith, they really need, if they're going to believe in a Jewish Messiah, doesn't it make sense that they become Jewish first? And Paul is actually arguing, no, that does not make sense. One of his arguments is verses like this, because if we require Gentile believers to convert to Judaism, there would be no more believing Gentiles. In other words, there would only be Jews, not Jews and Gentiles. And if there were no more believing Gentiles, then prophecies like this one from Isaiah could not be fulfilled, where you've got Gentiles coming under the God of Israel. And so a very subtle argument, but key to Paul's point. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt, going towards Assyria. And then a little bit of ominous mark here, verse 18, he lived in defiance of his relatives. So the 12 tribes of the Ishmaelites, there were 12, just like we'll have 12 tribes of Jacob, but they spread throughout the Middle East, but decidedly outside the land of Canaan. And this the mention of Havilah is interesting because it has the honor of being mentioned in the Garden of Eden. Talking about the 4 rivers flowing out of the garden, the name of the first is Pishon. It flows around the whole land of Havilah where there is gold. And I think that's interesting because the post-flood location most associated this is western Saudi Arabia. So we're back in Midian and Medina area, an area that does produce gold. This line about Havilah to Shur is possibly a caravan route, and so in latter times this was known as a spice trade route, and it was really the land of the Nabateans. You may hear that name from time to time. This word Assyria, it's the Hebrew word Ashur. One of my commentaries, John Walton, cautions that despite having the same word, this does not, in his view, represent the kingdom of Assyria in Mesopotamia, but rather a region in northern Arabia. So important to know that these names are used, recycled over and over again, and may not refer to Assyria. And then this line about settling in defiance of his relatives, that recalls Genesis 16:12. He Ishmael will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone. Everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live in defiance of his brothers. So as with the sons of Noah in Genesis 10 and 11, we have the favored line, the line with the greater promise, coming last, and really the less favored line coming first. So even back in Genesis 2, we saw this mankind was listed second in Genesis 2, made distinct from all other acts of creation. And then in Genesis 10:11, we had Ham followed by Shem. And then here we're going to have the line of Ishmael, but really who we are interested in is Isaac. And then we'll look at that in the next verse. Now these are the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was unable to have children, and the Lord answered him, and his wife Rebekah conceived. So I say semicolon there because that semicolon actually lasts about 20 years. The narration just flows, but one thing we pick up from math is he was 40 when he was married, he was 60 when he became a father, and so he had to wait 20 years for God to grant his prayer. And so again, this theme of God not answering Isaac's plea immediately, but he had to wait and become patient. And so God's going to intervene with another supernatural opening of a closed womb. And all of these really are foreshadowing Mary, because we don't typically think of Mary as barren, but her womb was closed and she had to have a supernatural conception. And whenever that happens, the offspring is tremendously special, as was Jesus. So we could say that all of the biblical barren women in the Hebrew Bible, and we've seen Sarah and Rebecca so far, are types and foreshadows of the mother of the Messiah. She says, but the children struggled within her, and she says, if it is so, why am I in this condition? We've got our graphic novel, cartoon pains telling the story here in Hebrew. So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples will be separated from your body. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. So in other words, from a practical standpoint, they struggled, and so her pregnancy was complicated and difficult. She apparently knows she's going to have multiples because she says, the children struggled within her, so they knew that. But the Lord said it's actually bigger than just these 2 boys. It is, nations are going to grow, and you will be blessed in that way. But this oracle doesn't necessarily indicate that the parents should treat the children any differently. So that's one thing we get from the text. But it's not one thing Isaac and Rebekah do. They tend to play favorites. Paul is going to reference this prophecy in his discussion about sovereign election in Romans 9. And so he's going to say, before they had done anything good or bad, meaning before Jacob and Esau had done anything good or bad, God still chose one over the other. And that is just God's sovereign election. And that is God's sovereign right. And so one argument that Paul is making is that just because one is descended from Abraham, which Esau was, that doesn't automatically mean that that person receives a promise. And so we need to look in the mirror and say, just because I call myself a Christian, that doesn't mean that I actually am part of God's elect. And so this is something that Calvinists pick up on. They're not wrong in this, because there is a sense of predetermination on whom God chooses. And so, but we each have choices to make as to how we will serve him, right? Because Jacob was elected, but he still messed up quite a bit, and he still had a lot of growing to do. So again, I don't want to say it's all predestination or it's all free will, but I think there is definitely a combination of things going on here. And, for us to try and get in the mind of God, that's just dangerous territory. I love the phrase that a God big enough or God small enough for your mind is not big enough for your needs. And so we just need to kind of keep that in mind. And This does seem unfair in some sense because God is selecting, he's kind of condemning Esau here, but maybe it's because God knows Esau's heart, and Esau wouldn't be a good representative of him anyway. I will have mercy on whomever I have mercy. I will show compassion to whomever I show compassion. So then it does not depend on the person who wants it, nor the one who runs, but on God who has mercy. When her days leading to the delivery were at an end, behold, there were twins in her womb. Now the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they named him Esau. Afterwards, his brother came out with his hand holding onto Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob, or in Hebrew, Yaakov. And Isaac was 60 years old. There's the 60-year-old reference when she gave birth to them. And you can see the arrows pointing to Ba'akev, and Yaakov is Jacob's name. So it's related to the word for heel. And because of Jacob's later behavior, the word heel grabber takes on a negative connotation. And so the name Yaakov comes to mean supplanter. Esau means, in Hebrew, Esau means rough or hairy. And so it's true that there's a kind of a prophecy here. Indeed, Jacob becomes somewhat of a trickster, and Esau becomes rough and disagreeable. Here we also see that he came out red, and so he's going to be another name that Esau will be given is Edom, and that means red. So there's going to be a pun coming up a little bit later. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a civilized man living in tents. Now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Do not play favorites if you're a parent. Based on this comment that Jacob dwelt in tents, sometimes he is seen as effeminate, while Esau is more of a man's man. But I believe that's reading modern values into the text. We kind of see this in the cartoons here too. And, they show Esau as out gathering game, and Jacob's kind of a homemaker. That's not really accurate. Abraham also dwelled in tents. Since shepherds also dwelt in tents as they moved around, Walton suggests that Jacob might have been some kind of herder, livestock of some kind, not necessarily sheep. But Esau was a hunter of non-domesticated animals, and so we have this sense of one's domesticated, one's civilized, and the other is rough and non-domesticated. It does seem fair to draw a connection with earlier brothers. So Cain and Abel and Ishmael and Isaac. The former were hot-tempered and defiant, and it cost them, and the others were more reasonable, if you want to say that. Is it ever a good thing when parents play favorites, even when such favoritism might be entirely justified by the kids? Both of my kids maintain that we favored the other one, and so maybe we're doing something right there. When Jacob had cooked a stew one day, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please let me have a mouthful of that red stuff there, for I am exhausted." Therefore he was called Edom by name. Edom means red. But Jacob said, "First, sell me your birthright." And you can see this played out in the cartoon there. Another theme in the Bible is that the firstborn son often forfeits his double portion. So the way it was supposed to work is that the firstborn would get twice what everyone else did. So if a man had 3 sons, the first would get 1/2, and the remaining sons would get 1/4 each. So basically, you add 1 and then give the extra portion to the firstborn. So if there were 2 sons, the first son would get 2/3, and the second son would get 1/3. In the Hebrew Bible, it's clear that Ishmael's act of mocking in Genesis 21 resulted in his forfeiting his inheritance, and that now fell to Isaac. And of course, Isaac was a chosen one. So what's being negotiated here is that extra portion. So instead of Esau getting the 2/3 and Jacob getting the 1/3, Jacob's negotiating to get 2/3 and Esau 1/3. This word for porridge in Hebrew, it's what Esau says is red stuff or reddish red. And because of this, he gets the name Edom. And Edom is related to the word Adam, and it also means red like clay. So apparently Adam had a reddish complexion, kind of ruddy there. His people will be known as the Edomites, and they will become the enemies of the Israelites because Jacob will also take on the alternate name of Israel. So we've got these alternate names going on, becoming the favored name of the nation, and then these two guys are going to do battle with each other. So on the left side of the screen, you can see the Old Testament names. You got Moab, Edom, and then Midian, which we looked at, going down really in the area of modern Jordan and Saudi Arabia today. Now, in the New Testament, the Edomites become known as the Idumeans, or the region of Idumea. You can see that on the map on the right. So King Herod was not Jewish, but he was Idumean by birth. And so when he gets this visit from the Magi, and they say, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" So Herod wasn't Jewish, yet he claimed that title, King of the Jews, but he wasn't born Jewish. Edom thus becomes a pseudonym for any enemy of the Jews, including and especially Rome. So because Herod aligns with Rome, and you'll see this in the Jewish writings, they'll refer to Rome as Edom. Edom is just the kind of the quintessential enemy of the Jewish people. Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die, so what use is this birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "First swear to me." So he swore an oath to him, sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, so he ate and drank and got up and went on his way. So Esau despised his birthright. Commentators are mixed on whether we should read this as shady and unethical extortion by Jacob, or a total lack of respect by Esau because God gave him the gift of being the firstborn and he despised it. So I tend to see it as both. Jacob clearly was not modeling God's desire for us to love our neighbors as ourselves. That comes from Leviticus 19:18, and of course Jesus reiterates that. At the same time, the last verse there is very clear that Esau despised his birthright. So any sympathy we might have for Esau being taken advantage of needs to be tempered by the statement that he didn't regard it very well at all. This seems to be another instance, though, of Jacob taking matters into his own hands. God already had a plan for Jacob to have the status of the firstborn, and I'm sure his mother told him that back before you were born. Guess what? God said you will rule over the older. So just like in Genesis 16, whenever we try to help speed up God's plans, it tends not to work out so well. And so this is going to start this feud, and it's going to come full circle as Isaac is going to give a blessing. We'll see that in a couple chapters, and Jacob will have to end up fleeing for his life. As opposed to taking place in the home, the thought is if it took place in the home, then either parent probably could have mediated the situation. Walton suggests that Esau was out hunting and stumbled upon Jacob's flocks. And so this explains why Jacob was able to dictate terms. Likely, Jacob could have had other shepherds or field hands who were there to witness the agreement. So some people say that this oath was not witnessed, but it may have been. We just don't know. The word for despised is translated as utter contempt in other places in the Bible. So it could mean that he just had a cavalier attitude towards his birthright. In any case, he's going to later regret this when we get to Genesis 27. So as we look at Jacob and Esau, we need to do the opposite, because Hebrews 12 says, "Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord." And so there's a sense that Jacob did not pursue peace with all people because he capitalized on his brother's situation. He did not love his neighbor as himself. At the same time, Esau did not pursue holiness because he despised a precious gift from God. He did not love God with his whole heart, his soul, and might. So we've got both going on there as lessons to not be like that. The picture says much righteousness, much peace, and it's from a synagogue in Rome. And so as Talmidim, as disciples, we want to pursue peace and righteousness, just as Hebrews 12:14 says. And it's interesting that in this passage, the writer of the Hebrews connects this with this episode we just read in Genesis. So I'll read the whole thing. "Pursue peace with all people, holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God. No root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it may become defiled. That there be no sexually immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal." And that's fascinating. We'll look at that on the next slide. I find this picture kind of funny because it makes Esau look kind of Scottish more than Israelite. But that Hebrew verse presents us with this look into Jewish tradition, because the Bible doesn't tell us specifically that Esau was a fornicator. It just says that he prefers Canaanite wives in Genesis 26. Later, he's going to marry into the line of Ishmael in Genesis 28. But from this, Jewish tradition builds this narrative that Esau was just a vile, wicked person. And we have the Hebrews writer validating that, and I think that's interesting. So he in any case, he was not a long-range thinker, and he just appeared to be in it for the moment. So despite being a short chapter, there's a few themes and lessons we can take away. The first is families are complicated, but with a spirit of humility and reconciliation, that can be a blessing. So Isaac and Ishmael came together to honor their father's death, just as Jacob and Esau will later. Second is the importance of next is the importance of waiting on God's timing. So Isaac had to wait 20 years to have a son, almost as long as Abraham waited. And yet, unlike Abraham, he didn't take matters into his own hand to try and speed things along. Now, in contrast, Jacob was already promised to be the firstborn son, and yet Jacob does try to speed things up. He extorted the birthright from Esau, even though he'd already been promised that he would be superior. So our choices have long-term consequences. Making a quick decision based on a temporary situation like Esau did could mean forfeiting a later blessing. So we see that with Esau. And despite being this shady character, this kind of shyster, God still chose to work through Jacob. And the lesson there is even when we mess up, God is not done with us. We need to be like Abraham finally and make sure that when we die, others will say of us, he or she was satisfied with life. And that doesn't mean living for yourself, but it means living with a view like Abraham did of serving God and being faithful. So that is the Genesis 25. Next time we'll look at Genesis 26, and we'll see that Isaac's not perfect either. He gets himself into a little bit of trouble. So we'll see you next time for Genesis 26.